December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow fell in heavy silence across the winter-dark woods of the Ardennes. The pines, ancient and thick, bent under the weight of ice. American soldiers huddled in foxholes carved from frozen earth, their breath visible in the crystalline air. They had been told the war was nearly won. Christmas would be celebrated in warm billets. The German army, shattered and retreating, posed no serious threat. But that morning, as dawn struggled against the gray clouds, the forest erupted. Artillery shells tore through the canopy. Panzer engines growled like wounded beasts. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and with it, the largest crisis the Western Allies would face in Europe. 300 miles to the west, in the stone-walled headquarters of the 21st Army Group, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery received the news with a mixture of concern and vindication. For months he had argued that American commanders lacked the discipline, the strategic vision, and the professional competence to manage modern warfare. Now, as German forces punched a massive salient into Allied lines, it seemed his warnings had proven prophetic. The Americans, he believed, were amateurs playing at a professional's game, the making of a rivalry. To understand what followed in the winter of 1944 and spring of 1945, one must first understand the man who would become both symbol and scapegoat of Anglo-American tension. Bernard Montgomery was the son of an Anglican bishop, raised in Tasmania and educated at Sandhurst. He had survived the trenches of the First World War, where he was shot through the lung at the Battle of Metheren and left for dead. That experience forged in him an obsessive attention to detail, a determination never to waste soldiers' lives with hasty planning.
By 1942, he commanded the 8th Army in North Africa, where his methodical defeat of Rommel at El Alamein made him Britain's most celebrated general since Wellington. Montgomery believed in what he called tidy warfare. Every battle must be planned with mathematical precision, logistics, intelligence, air superiority, all pieces arranged before the first shot. He despised improvisation, viewing it as the refuge of incompetent commanders. This philosophy brought him victories, but it also made him insufferably arrogant. He demanded absolute control of operations, dismissing subordinates who questioned his judgment. Winston Churchill called him indomitable in retreat, invincible in advance, insufferable in victory. The Americans, in Montgomery's view, embodied everything wrong with modern military culture. They were enthusiastic but undisciplined, brave but tactically naive. Their commanders had never faced a professional enemy until landing in North Africa in 1942.
Even after 2 years of combat, Montgomery saw them as talented amateurs, capable of brute force but incapable of sophisticated maneuver. He said as much in private communications and increasingly in public statements that infuriated his allies across the Atlantic. Omar Bradley represented everything Montgomery dismissed. Born in 1893 to a Missouri schoolteacher, Bradley graduated from West Point in the same class as Dwight Eisenhower. He was known as the soldier's general, modest, soft-spoken, respected by his men for his competence rather than his charisma. He had commanded American forces in North Africa and Sicily, then led First Army through the Normandy breakout and the liberation of France.
By December 1944, he commanded the 12th Army Group, the largest American force ever assembled, over 1 million men, organized into 2 armies that stretched across eastern France and Belgium. Bradley had no patience for Montgomery's condescension. He had proven himself in battle after battle, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the streets of Paris.
His soldiers had broken through German defenses that Montgomery's forces had struggled against for weeks, yet the British Field Marshal continued to treat American commanders as subordinates requiring supervision, not partners deserving respect. The tension simmered through the autumn of 1944, held in check only by Eisenhower's diplomatic skill. The Ardennes offensive would bring it to a boil.
The crisis and the decision. When German forces attacked on December 16th, they achieved total surprise. American units, many of them green replacements resting in what they believed was a quiet sector, collapsed under the assault. Within days, 3 panzer armies had driven a bulge 50 miles deep into Allied lines. Roads became clogged with retreating soldiers and refugees. Communications broke down. Entire divisions found themselves surrounded, cut off from supply and reinforcement. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, faced a terrible problem. The German offensive had split Bradley's command in two. First Army, under General Courtney Hodges, was trapped north of the Bulge. Third Army, under General George Patton, remained to the south.
Bradley himself was headquartered in Luxembourg, unable to effectively coordinate the separated forces. Eisenhower needed a unified command for the northern sector, someone who could restore order, bring up reserves, and contain the German advance before it reached the Meuse River. On December 20th, Eisenhower made a decision that would poison Allied relations for decades.
He placed all American forces north of the Bulge, 1st and 9th Armies, totaling nearly 500,000 men, under Montgomery's command. The British Field Marshal would direct the defense of the northern shoulder, while Bradley managed Patton's counterattack from the south. From a military perspective, the decision made sense. Montgomery's headquarters was better positioned to communicate with northern units. British reserves could be brought forward more quickly under his coordination, but the political and psychological implications were catastrophic. Montgomery had spent months arguing that American commanders needed British supervision.
Now, in their moment of greatest crisis, Eisenhower had seemingly validated that claim. Montgomery arrived at 1st Army headquarters like a conqueror surveying captured territory. He wore his trademark beret and sheepskin jacket, trailed by staff officers and war correspondents. His first assessment, delivered to Hodges and other American generals, dripped with condescension. The Americans, he suggested, had been caught napping. Their defensive positions were poorly organized. Their counterattacks were piecemeal and uncoordinated. What they needed, Montgomery implied, was a professional to restore order.
In his diary that night, Montgomery wrote with barely concealed satisfaction, "The situation was beginning to deteriorate rapidly, and the American generals were losing their heads. I knew I must immediately get a tight grip on the battle." To British newspapers he was even less diplomatic, suggesting that only his intervention had prevented complete disaster.
American forces, he said, had been heading for trouble until proper command restored discipline and purpose. Bradley, reading these accounts from his headquarters in Luxembourg, felt rage that bordered on despair. His armies had not collapsed. They had bent under the fiercest German assault of the war, but they had not broken. American units surrounded at Bastogne and Saint-Lin. Vith were fighting with desperate courage, buying time for reserves to arrive. Patton was already wheeling 3rd Army 90 degrees north, a logistical miracle that Montgomery himself could never have accomplished with such speed. Yet the British Field Marshal took credit for saving a situation that American soldiers were saving through blood and determination.
The counteroffensive takes shape by early January 1945. The German offensive had stalled. Fuel shortages, stubborn American resistance, and deteriorating weather had blunted the Panzer spearheads. Now came the Allied counterattack, and here the contrast between Montgomery and Bradley would become stark. Montgomery wanted to wait.
His philosophy demanded overwhelming superiority before attacking 2-to-1 or even 3-to-1 odds, massive artillery preparation, absolute air dominance. He proposed consolidating all Allied forces for a single massive thrust toward the Rhine, commanded of course by himself. Such an operation, he estimated, could not be ready before March at the earliest. Until then, Allied forces should assume defensive positions and rebuild their strength. Bradley saw the situation differently. The Germans had exhausted themselves in the Ardennes. Their best divisions were battered, their fuel reserves depleted. The time to strike was now, before they could withdraw and establish new defensive lines. Every day of delay allowed the enemy to recover. He proposed twin offensives from north and south, pinching off the German salient and destroying its occupants before they could escape. Eisenhower supported Bradley's aggressive approach, but he faced a delicate problem. Montgomery still commanded the northern forces. Any offensive required his cooperation. The British Field Marshal, however, continued to insist that the Americans lacked the competence to execute coordinated attacks. He demanded full control of the entire operation, including Patton's 3rd Army. Bradley, he suggested in a memorandum to Eisenhower, had proven himself unable to manage forces of this scale.
Better to place all ground forces under a single commander, specifically under Montgomery himself. This demand finally exhausted Eisenhower's patience. In a meeting at Versailles on January 5th, he confronted Montgomery directly. There would be no unified ground command under British leadership. Bradley would retain control of American forces.
The counteroffensive would proceed as Bradley proposed, with 1st Army attacking from the north and 3rd Army from the south. Montgomery could participate or not, but he would not control American armies. Montgomery retreated, but not gracefully. In a press conference on January 7, he spoke to reporters with calculated ambiguity. He praised the courage of American soldiers while implying that only his leadership had prevented catastrophe. He described his role as having employed the whole available power of the British group of armies to save the situation. A statement technically true, but deliberately misleading.
British forces had indeed supported the northern defense, but the bulk of the fighting and dying had been done by Americans. American newspapers erupted in fury. Editorial writers demanded Montgomery's removal. Politicians called for a complete review of Allied command structure. Bradley received cables from generals threatening resignation if forced to continue serving under British command.
The alliance itself seemed in danger of fracturing. Bradley's answer. On January 8, 1945, First Army attacked from the north. On January 9, Third Army struck from the south. Montgomery had predicted failure. American forces were too disorganized, too depleted to conduct coordinated offensives. But Bradley had spent weeks positioning units, stockpiling ammunition, coordinating with tactical air forces. His staff had worked through Christmas organizing the logistics that Montgomery insisted were impossible. The twin offensives drove into the German salient with methodical violence. American divisions that Montgomery had written off as combat ineffective proved brutally effective.
Tank destroyers hunted panthers and tigers through frozen villages. Artillery battalions fired coordinated barrages that stunned German defenders. Infantry squads cleared houses room by room, fighting with the skill that came from hard experience. Patton's Third Army performed the logistical miracle that became legend.
In 72 hours, he had moved 3 entire divisions 90 degrees north, across ice-covered roads through a Belgian winter. His units relieved Bastogne on December 26, then continued attacking north. By mid-January, they had recaptured nearly all the ground lost in December. The German salient, which Montgomery had feared would take months to reduce, collapsed in weeks. In the north, First Army ground forward against desperate resistance. The Germans fought hardest here, knowing that breakthrough meant encirclement. But American commanders had learned their craft in the crucible of Normandy and the Hurtgen Forest. They used combined arms tactics that Montgomery still dismissed as amateurish infantry. Armor, artillery, and air power coordinated in attacks that overwhelmed German positions through speed and flexibility rather than massive preparation. By late January, the bulge was eliminated. German forces retreated across the German border, having lost 120,000 men, 800 tanks, and their last strategic reserve. American casualties were equally terrible, 80,000 killed, wounded, or captured, but the German army had been broken as an offensive force. Never again would it threaten a major counteroffensive. Montgomery claimed his share of credit, but the facts spoke otherwise. British forces had played a supporting role in the northern sector, valuable but not decisive. The bulk of the fighting, the heaviest casualties, and the operational victories belonged to American units. Bradley had orchestrated the counteroffensive that Montgomery said was impossible. He had done so with armies Montgomery called amateur, using tactics Montgomery dismissed as unsophisticated. The proof lay in the snow-covered battlefields of Belgium, marked by the wreckage of German divisions that would never fight again. The drive to the Rhine, February and March 1945, brought the final humiliation to Montgomery's claims of American incompetence.
As Allied armies approached the Rhine, the last natural barrier protecting Germany, Montgomery prepared his set-piece crossing. Operation Plunder would be the culmination of his career, a massive, perfectly planned assault across the river north of the Ruhr industrial region. He assembled 1 million men, over 3,000 artillery pieces, and stockpiled supplies for weeks. The crossing was scheduled for late March, with preliminary operations beginning in early February. Bradley had different plans. His forces would strike toward the Rhine across a broad front, seizing every crossing opportunity. If bridges could be captured intact, so much the better. If not, American engineers would construct pontoon spans and ferry units across. The key was speed and flexibility, hitting the Germans before they could organize coherent defenses. On March 7th, elements of the U.S. 9th Armored Division reached the Rhine at Remagen, a small town south of Bonn. There, impossibly, stood the Ludendorff Bridge, a railway span that German engineers had tried and failed to demolish. American infantry charged across under fire, cut demolition wires, and secured the east bank. For the first time since Napoleon, an invading army held a bridge over the Rhine. Bradley poured forces across that bridge with reckless speed. Engineers worked under artillery fire to strengthen the damaged structure. By the time it collapsed on March 17th, American engineers had constructed pontoon bridges upstream and down. 5 divisions were across the Rhine, establishing a bridgehead that would crack open Germany's western defenses. Patton crossed 3 weeks before Montgomery's elaborate operation.
On the night of March 22nd, his forces assaulted the Rhine near Oppenheim, using assault boats and minimal preparation. German defenses were light. The enemy had concentrated forces opposite Montgomery's massive buildup. By dawn, Patton had 2 divisions across. He telephoned Bradley with theatrical pride. "Brad, we sneaked a crossing without even telling the papers." Then, in a gesture of pure spite toward Montgomery's methodical approach, he stopped mid-river to urinate into the Rhine, photographed by a knowing war correspondent. Montgomery finally launched Operation Plunder on March 23rd. It succeeded, of course, with overwhelming force and meticulous preparation. It could hardly fail, but it was anticlimactic, a carefully choreographed performance after American forces had already proven the Rhine could be crossed by speed and audacity rather than months of preparation. British newspapers celebrated Montgomery's achievement, but military historians noted the contrast. American armies had crossed the Rhine in multiple locations with minimal preparation. Montgomery's single crossing, for all its careful planning, accomplished less with far greater resources. The ideological battle. The conflict between Montgomery and Bradley was never purely professional. It represented fundamentally different visions of warfare and, more deeply, different ideologies about how modern democracies should fight. Montgomery embodied the European military tradition, hierarchical, class-conscious, rooted in centuries of professional military culture. Officers were gentlemen, educated at elite schools, trained to command with absolute authority. Soldiers were materials to be deployed efficiently, their courage and sacrifice managed through careful planning that minimized waste. This approach had evolved from the trenches of the First World War, where hundreds of thousands died in badly planned offensives. Never again, Montgomery's generation vowed, would soldiers be squandered through incompetent leadership. Bradley represented something newer and more dangerous to traditional hierarchies, the American conception of the citizen soldier. His officers came from every social class. Many had been civilians until Pearl Harbor. They learned warfare through experience rather than military academies. His soldiers were farmers, factory workers, shop clerks, who would become competent killers through training and necessity. They expected explanations, not just orders. They fought for democratic ideals, not aristocratic honor or imperial glory. This difference manifested in how the 2 generals treated subordinates. Montgomery demanded obedience and punished questioning of his authority. Bradley encouraged initiative from junior officers, praising those who achieved objectives even when they deviated from plan. Montgomery saw warfare as chess played by masters. Bradley saw it as organized violence requiring both planning and improvisation. German generals, interrogated after the war, offered surprising assessments. They feared Montgomery's set-piece offensives less than American operational flexibility. British attacks were predictable. Massive preparation, overwhelming force at a single point, methodical exploitation. German defenders could identify where Montgomery would strike and concentrate forces accordingly. American attacks were harder to counter because American commanders adapted to changing situations. When one approach failed, they tried another. When a gap appeared in German defenses, American units exploited it immediately, rather than waiting for orders. This operational flexibility stemmed from ideological roots. American officers were encouraged to think independently, to seize opportunities without higher approval. This sometimes led to mistakes, to uncoordinated attacks, and wasted opportunities. But it also produced stunning successes that rigid command structures could never achieve. Patton's relief of Bastogne, Bradley's rapid Rhine crossings, the aggressive pursuit of German forces through France all reflected an organizational culture that valued initiative over obedience. Montgomery could never accept this approach as legitimate military practice. To him, it was barely controlled chaos, successful only through overwhelming material superiority. He wrote after the war that American forces would have failed against a competent enemy. That they succeeded against Germany, he implied, proved only that German resistance had already been broken by British and Soviet forces. American contributions were valuable but derivative, the work of enthusiastic apprentices rather than military professionals. The symbolic weight of abundance throughout the conflict. One element continuously highlighted the contrast between British and American approaches, the sheer material abundance that American forces commanded. Montgomery planned operations around scarcity, carefully husbanding ammunition, fuel, and equipment. American commanders assumed plenty. Artillery fired prodigious barrages. Tactical air forces flew continuous missions. Broken equipment was replaced immediately. This abundance wasn't merely economic. It reflected philosophical differences about the value of human life versus material resources. The American soldier's ration became symbol of this divide.
C rations and later K rations provided more calories than British equivalents, included luxuries like cigarettes and candy, and were distributed with casual abundance. American quartermasters threw away food that British soldiers would have carefully saved. Supply dumps stretched for acres, stocked with everything from ammunition to typewriter ribbons.
German soldiers captured by American forces reported shock at the casual waste vehicles abandoned because of minor mechanical problems, equipment discarded rather than repaired. Montgomery saw this abundance as proof of American strategic incompetence. Proper military operations required careful logistics, not overwhelming everything with material. Bradley saw it differently. Why should soldiers suffer scarcity when abundance was possible? Why husband ammunition when industrial production could replace it? American economic power allowed a different kind of warfare, one that minimized casualties through expenditure of material rather than blood. This philosophy manifested most dramatically in tactical air power. American commanders routinely called artillery and airstrikes on German positions before attacking. Bradley's doctrine emphasized combined arms. Never send infantry against prepared positions without first devastating them with artillery and bombs. Montgomery criticized this as wasteful and indicative of poor infantry training.
British forces, he insisted, could achieve the same results with less expenditure through superior tactics. But American commanders had done the calculus differently. Yes, massive firepower support cost money and resources, but it saved lives. American soldiers advanced behind rolling barrages that stunned defenders.
They fought with a confidence that came from knowing air support was minutes away. The psychological advantage was incalculable. German defenders facing American attacks knew they would be pounded by artillery, bombed by fighter bombers, and then assaulted by fresh infantry supported by armor. This combination broke morale as effectively as it destroyed positions. The abundance extended beyond material to human resources. American replacement systems kept units near full strength. Wounded soldiers received rapid evacuation and sophisticated medical care that saved lives at unprecedented rates. Training centers in England and France produced steady streams of replacements. When Montgomery complained that American units attacked without sufficient preparation, Bradley could respond that his forces were fresh and aggressive, while Montgomery waited for perfect conditions. That never arrived. The reconciliation that never came victory in Europe, achieved May 8, 1945, should have reconciled the two generals. Instead, it hardened their mutual contempt into historical legacy. Montgomery published memoirs that portrayed American commanders as brave but incompetent, requiring British guidance throughout the war. Bradley's memoirs, published years later, described Montgomery as insufferably arrogant, more concerned with personal glory than Allied victory.
Historians have spent decades adjudicating their dispute. British scholars tend to support Montgomery's emphasis on careful planning and professional competence. American historians praise Bradley's operational flexibility and aggressive spirit.
German generals interviewed after the war gave contradictory assessments, sometimes praising Montgomery's professionalism, sometimes expressing relief when facing British rather than American forces. The truth, inevitably more complex than either man admitted, was that both approaches had merit. Montgomery's careful preparation prevented disasters like Operation Market Garden, except when it didn't. Bradley's aggressive opportunism produced stunning successes, except when it led to overextension and unnecessary casualties. The Western Allies won not because one approach proved superior, but because they had the resources to absorb mistakes and the flexibility to learn from them.
What remained undeniable was that American armies, dismissed by Montgomery as amateurs, had proven themselves the equal of any force in Europe. They had suffered terrible defeats in Tunisia and at Kasserine Pass, but they had learned. By 1945, American divisions were as tactically sophisticated as any Wehrmacht unit, better supported, and far more aggressive.
Bradley had not proven Montgomery wrong through argument but through results, through bridgeheads seized, rivers crossed, and German armies destroyed. The last word. The symbolic moment came not during the war but years after, in the Cold War tensions that reshaped Europe. NATO required cooperation between American and British forces, forcing old rivals to work together against a new threat. Montgomery, by then a viscount and elder statesman of British military circles, grudgingly acknowledged American competence. Bradley, retired but still influential, admitted that Montgomery's caution had sometimes prevented costly mistakes. But neither man truly recanted.
Montgomery went to his grave believing that proper military professionalism required European traditions of hierarchy and careful planning. Bradley remained convinced that American operational flexibility represented the future of warfare, decentralized command, aggressive action, and the empowerment of junior leaders to seize opportunities.
The debate they embodied transcended personalities or even military doctrine. It represented fundamental questions about democracy and warfare. Could citizen soldiers match professional armies? Could democratic societies, which questioned authority and valued individual initiative, fight as effectively as hierarchical ones that demanded obedience? Could abundance substitute for tradition, industrial power for military culture? The winter of 1944 to 1945 had answered those questions in blood and snow across the Ardennes. American armies, commanded by Generals Montgomery, dismissed as amateurs, had contained the last great German offensive, then crushed it through aggressive counterattack. They had crossed the Rhine faster and with less preparation than Montgomery's elaborate set-piece operation. They had advanced into Germany with speed that stunned even their own commanders, covering in weeks distances that Montgomery's careful planning said would take months. History remembers Montgomery as one of Britain's great generals, the victor of El Alamein, the professional who never wasted soldiers' lives. History remembers Bradley as the quiet American who led the largest army his nation ever fielded, the soldier's general who won through competence rather than charisma.
But history also remembers the winter when Montgomery called American armies amateur, and Bradley proved him wrong through the only argument that mattered in total war, victory, purchased in blood but decisive in its judgment. The snow has long since melted from the Ardennes forests. The foxholes have filled with earth and leaves. The Sherman tanks rusting in Belgian barns have been hauled away to museums, where they sit beside Tiger tanks and British Cromwells, artifacts of a conflict that consumed a world and rebuilt it. But the lesson remains, inscribed in the earth where American soldiers fought against Montgomery's condescension and German steel with equal determination, that democracies at war are neither fragile nor amateur, that abundance guided by competent leadership becomes overwhelming force, and that citizen soldiers, properly led, can defeat any professional army ever fielded.
Montgomery never admitted it. But in the spring of 1945, as American armies drove toward Berlin and British forces struggled to keep pace, the admission was unnecessary. The battlefield had spoken with authority no field marshal could overrule.